You're certainly still tuned into your favorite breakfast show on Nigeria's first full HD television. Now, this part of the show this morning by actually picking up from where newspaper reviews stopped with Julius Ilori by continuing the conversation very briefly on International Day of Education. Now, the theme for this year's International Day of Education is changing course, transforming education. Now, education is a human right, a public good, and a public responsibility. The United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 24 January as International Day of Education in celebration of the role of education for peace and development. International Day of Education 2022 will be celebrated under the theme Changing Course, Transforming Education. The celebration led by the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, the UNESCO, aims to showcase the most important transformations that have to be nurtured to realize everyone's fundamental right to education and build a more sustainable, inclusive, and peaceful future. Now, to have this conversation with us this morning, we have Rachel Balogun, a programs officer, the programs officer for Learners Corner, here to help us understand this particular, International Day of Education and the role of education in the lives of children today. How are you doing, Rachel?
I'm very fine, Adi.
Good morning.
Good morning to you too.
Very lovely to have you. Now, I know your colleague Julius already started off, with Esther on the newspaper review team, but we're going to, that was the newspaper review. Now we're on the tea or coffee space. Okay. So we're going to be looking at, this conversation, according to the values of our program, right? And the first question I would like to ask you, because, as regards to education, a lot has happened, with the pandemic, with insecurity and insurgency in Nigeria. A lot of things seems to have affected education. So my first question is, what is education? Has the definition of education changed as a result of, the time that we're in? What is education?
Okay, so education is the process of facilitating learning. It's the process of acquiring knowledge,
right,
skills, values, beliefs. Like you mentioned during the intro, education is a fundamental human right. Education, if success were to be life, education is like a cell. It is fundamental. It is the basic building block. Without education, we cannot progress. Commerce cannot progress. Lives cannot be changed. We can't have any development. So education is very fundamental, and it is the process where we acquire knowledge and information to make informed decisions.
Okay. Now, before the pandemic, a lot of people were saying that the education, the curriculum, for instance, is outdated. The way we do education now is outdated. So, on Tea or Coffee, for instance, we've spoken about Montessori schools, with the new way Montessori or the new modes of learning that Montessori education provides children with. So now that forms my next question. Do you think education, the way we're doing education now in our society, is outdated? Are the curriculums outdated? And what can be done regarding this?
Well, specific education, like education targeted to develop professionals, education that builds lawyers, education that builds doctors, education that builds accountants, for instance. I would say that I won't say everything is completely outdated,
right,
but yes, most of our curriculum is outdated. It's not preparing young people for the future of work. Apart from people who know, certainly I finish school, I become a lawyer, I start the practice, right? That kind of education may still be preparing them for work today, but not for the future of work. So we need to revisit our curriculum. We need to look at what does the world need? What kind of learning, what kind of information, what kind of work and employment will be taking place 5, 10, 15 years from now? How do we prepare our young people for that type of education. So yes, our curriculum would definitely need adjustments, would need innovation, would need to introduce new knowledge to the curriculum.
All right. So the theme for International Day of Education is changing course, transforming education, and we've already started talking about the changing course of education. Now, what role does technology have to play in the changing course and the transformation of education in our society today?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that question. We've always needed to adapt education to technology, but the pandemic made that even more obvious. It made it more glaring that we are late. You know, the fact that some schools, some children are yet to adapt to education via technology, we are already late.
Right.
So technology has a huge role to play. What if there's another pandemic? You know, Robert Jenkins, Director of Education at the UNICEF, he says that 635 million children still grapple with getting back into school because their schools have been shut. So how are they learning? During the pandemic, technology really helped to abate the pressure, the gap, all of the you know, challenges that came with not being able to be in school and learn in person. But with technology, you can learn from any part of the world. You can learn from anywhere, you know, you are, which is one of the things that we're trying to do at Learner's Corner, to be able to help any child learn from wherever they are with a device, with access to the internet. You pick up your phone. So yes, technology is really important. If we are going to change the course of education, we would need to adapt to technology very fast.
Okay, but is Nigeria ready for e-learning? Is Nigeria ready for you know, an idea like Learner's Corner? Is a Nigerian students and Nigerian educators, are they ready to leave the four walls of a building and then take this into a digital space? Are we ready?
So I would say that in a way we are, but we have concerns for the marginalized. So the people who can afford to get devices, they can, you know, they already learn a lot from YouTube, from the internet. They use devices. They're learning. They are socializing, acquiring knowledge, informal education in various ways. But what about the marginalized? So we would also need to look at innovations that would help and not leave them behind, right? Because the idea is to leave no one behind. So if we say, okay, we can adapt education for people who can afford devices, people have access to electricity, even though electricity is unstable, but they can get alternative means, people who can afford internet regularly, you know, what about people who can't? Does that mean that their education should stop? Yeah, so we're not fully ready until we can answer the question, until we can make sure that nobody is left behind. We're not fully ready.
Okay. Now I know during the pandemic, interestingly enough, one of our main conversations this morning on Tea or Coffee is actually looking at digital marketing compared to traditional marketing, for instance, digital media compared to traditional media. I say that now because I know during the pandemic, right, I remember there was a time I was in traffic and I was listening to a class being taught on the radio or being delivered on the radio. So, you know, there's a role of digital media, but can traditional media, you know, for the marginalized group that you mentioned, which I'm so glad you actually mentioned, can traditional media help to maybe close that gap?
Yeah, so that could be a possible option, right? Traditional media, radio learning, but we would also need collaborated efforts to ensure that not everybody listens to the radio. The show may be playing, but not everybody may be listening. So how do we know that the effort is actually achieving what it was intended to do?
You can't measure it.
Yes, you can't measure it, but you need collaborated efforts. An intervention could probably be, okay, how do we make sure that radio is getting to every home? And how do we ensure that at so and so time, collaborating with parents, collaborating with the students to learn, you know, this is your radio time, make sure you tune in. We would need all of those external efforts as well. So it's one thing for the show to air and, you know, the presenter is teaching. It's another thing for the people who it is intended to reach to actually be learning from it. But yes, traditional media could definitely help.
All right, so now I want to talk about the different factors, the agencies around education, around the education of a child, right? So we've spoken about, for instance, private organizations, what private organizations are doing, you know. Now, how about parents? What is the role of a parent? What can parents do to ensure, that their child are getting the best out of these new forms of education, these new modes of learning?
So if you ask me, I would say that it's the intention of every parent for their child to do well, for their child to prosper. So yeah, definitely parents would be interested. The question is, are parents aware? Do they know? Do they know? Because some parents look at technology and they're like, it's evil. It's making my children bad. Don't know technology, just read your book. And there are so many things that children can learn online. So the first thing I would say would be to educate parents. Do schools have a digital policy, for instance? Can they admonish parents? Do they tell their parents, like, let your kids learn online. These are some sites, these are some resources we need them to visit. Please get these devices for them. I know some schools that mandate it, that if your child must attend our school, they need a laptop, and parents will run around. They don't have the money, they'll find it. They buy the kids a laptop. You see kids as little as 10-year-olds, they're coming to school with their laptops because schools can also make that effort. I believe that, once parents see the good use of these devices. I mean, every parent wants their kid to do well, so they would.
Okay, all right, right. Okay, now let's talk about the government, right? So we've looked at the roles of the parents. Parents need to be sensitized more, need to ensure that, for instance,
they can provide.
Checking the digital policies in schools and things like this. Now, what role does the government have to play in this conversation?
The government plays a major role. Major role. The government could, for instance, enforce e-learning in schools. Government policies go a long way in ensuring that change occurs, in ensuring that things are done. Provision, allocating some of the resources to also getting infrastructure, getting facilities, getting schools. So maybe private schools may be able to ensure that, in their schools, they have devices, they have the facility, they have standard computer labs. But what about public schools? What about students who go to public schools? So the government would also need to put structures, facilities in place to ensure that schools can cope, schools can adapt, and then the policies, And I'm aware that the Office of Education Quality Assurance is doing something to ensure that schools adapt blended learning, schools adapt e-learning, and they put the proper structures in place. But yes, we definitely need the government to put funds and put policies in place.
Okay. That's actually interesting to see that the government is pushing for e-learning, because this is how, please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how the sensitization of the parents, as you rightfully pointed out, really begins, doesn't it? Because, when the government is pushing for these things, parents are forced to learn about these things because obviously they are affecting their children. Now, as we're concluding, what do you think is the most effective learning environment a child needs to be in to get the best out of that child? So, whether a digital space, whether a physical space, is a combination of both. Like, what kind of environment does a child need to be in?
Okay, so when we look at the conducive environment, we need to look at the facilities in place. Is the classroom comfortable for the child, or are they sitting on the floor to learn? How are they learning? We would also look at the socio-cultural environment.
Okay.
What culture is in place in the school that promotes learning for the child? So do teachers harass the students? Do they verbally, emotionally harass them? Do students really believe that they can learn, or do they believe that school is calm? What kind of socio-cultural environment, even from the parents? Do the parents encourage them to learn? Do the parents encourage them to see education as a means to prosperity, a means to getting better out of life? Peer-to-peer, student to students, what kind of interactions are they having? Are they distracted? All of this combines together to form the right kind of environment. Because if we look at the difference between high-flying students and students who barely get along, you see it's not just the subjects that they are being taught, but also their mindset towards learning, also the mindset of their teachers. We look at things like our teachers are aware of concepts like educational leadership, and how their role in the life of a child as a teacher goes beyond just passing across information to ensuring that children can actually use and apply this information. So when we look at the facility, but it goes beyond the facility. A school can have all of the facility. Look at what happened at Dowen College. I want to believe that they had all of the facility. I want to believe that the students were not sitting on the floor. They looked good. They looked okay. And the parents who sent them there could afford the fees. So it goes beyond having the classroom looking nice, having AC in your classroom, your teacher is speaking Queen's English. It goes beyond that to also looking at socioculturally, what are we doing? How do we have policies in place to deal with bullying, for instance? Do we tolerate and say, well, seniors will always act like that, or are we hard on, you know, bullying other students? What about online safety? So how do we, you know, how do we ensure that as we are putting students online and telling them, learn online, learn digitally, how are we making sure that they know how to protect themselves? They are not victims to cybercrime. We're not exposing them to, you know, sexual advances, you know, that come up from when they are using the internet. We're also preparing them against things like hate speech, stalking, even cyberbullying. How do we make sure that children are not creating WhatsApp groups to pick on another student? So all of these things combined actually ensures that a child has the right learning environment. So we look at their physical conducive environment, we look at the social-cultural environment, which has to do with how their culture, how the culture of learning is, and then we look at the online environment. So I think all of this combined, students will be able to learn properly.
All right. Now, taking all of that into consideration, how important is the role, and what is the role of a teacher and educator in the learning experience of a child?
Teachers are very important.
Indeed.
We can't diminish their role. Yeah. Teachers are like the captains, you know, they are spearheading this change. And if we do not take care of the teachers, well, we won't get much out of the students. The students will not even want to go to school.
Right.
Because, yeah, I mean,
the teachers are not
exactly. Like, right. Every time I come to class, my teacher is grumpy. I will just go to class because my parents want me to leave the house. But if we take care of our teachers, if we help them find the value in what they're actually doing, if we make sure that they're properly rewarded for their work, I believe that teachers will do better. If we ensure that, you know, if we find the motivation behind why teachers are teachers in the first place, which is why I appreciate what organizations like Teach for Nigeria are doing.
Okay.
You know, so you apply, you sign up, they train you, and then you get paired with a low-cost school. So you know that it's not just, you are not just teaching because you can't find another job. There's a passion. So if we help teachers unlock, you know, the value behind what they're doing, what a teacher does is like, there's an adage that says the person who plants a tree is not the person that would enjoy the benefits from that tree, right? So teachers are planting trees. 10, 15 years down the line, the students leave their class, but you never really forget that teacher that made an impact in your life. So we need to help teachers find the value in what they're doing and also make sure that we are rewarding them properly.
Beautifully said, Rachel. Thank you very much for joining us
so
on Tea or Coffee, Rachel Balogun. I've actually learned a lot, and I think I'm going to call my teachers to appreciate them this morning because, you know, they need a lot of love. Do. All right, so that is Rachel Balogun on the conversation of International Day of Education this morning, themed Changing Course, Transforming Education.